Hello, welcome to week number 6. This is Marty, your instructor for Anthropology 3101, Foundations in Cultural Anthropology. This week's module is on writing cultures, and it's a bit hefty. It's about 31 slides in here, but there's some important information about some significant changes that occurred in anthropology around the 70s, 60s, and 70s. And then the other lecture, video lecture number 2, I'll cover some of the other material in the course, but this one focused mostly on Clifford Geertz, which is one of the readings for week 6. And just a little note, I'm 2 weeks, I think, now behind on grading, so I appreciate your patience. I'm hoping by today, Monday, or at least tomorrow, Tuesday of week 6, I'll get those back to you. So just be patient. All right. So on writing cultures, the big idea, as some anthropologists began attending carefully to issues of power and history, others embarked on anthropological approaches that centered on personal, embedded, and phenomenological experiences in the field. By the latter half of the 20th century, postmodernism, an artistic and academic pursuit that challenged universalizing and positivist discourses associated with modernism, had become an important and controversial strain in anthropological research. In particular, theorists in this section call attention to partiality and subjectivity in research endeavors and to ethnographic writing as art instead of science. So you're going to find in week 6 that there's this break from the past in anthropological theory and methods where people aspired to be scientific. We have authors and theorists that wanted to look more at writing and producing ethnographic work as an art. And for some people this works, and for others it doesn't. But let's see what Clifford Geertz has to say. For week 6, a couple learning objectives: identify major characteristics of postmodern anthropology, describe how attention to researcher experiences shapes anthropological writing and creative work, explain an array of approaches to fieldwork that include audible, visual, and embodied forms of knowledge. So the Balinese cockfight, you have an excerpt from a book by Clifford Geertz, 1926 to 2006. So he was a key character in this arena that we're going to talk about, postmodernism, but as well as interpretive anthropology, which there's a lot of slides in here about this approach. So his major areas of work, field work, were in Bali, Java, Indonesia. And he's, when you think of Clifford Geertz, you think of this term called thick description. And one little plug, as you do your projects toward the end of the course, if you want to invoke or apply thick description, this next set of slides in his reading will be useful, and hopefully it'll make more sense. But the goal when I make these little plugs is to get you to look at concepts from the course, from the weeks 1 through 10, roughly 1 through 12, and then apply them in your own work. And it means introducing them, defining them, a little synopsis, how people like Clifford Geertz use the thick description, and then applying it in your own work and offering critique. And of course, putting your own intellectual spin on things. So thick description, there's this focus on winks and blinks, and it'll make sense in the reading. But essentially, these gestures, these things that we do as people, these are to be read as text, that when you apply interpretive anthropology, then they make sense because of the meanings that we put on them. And for Clifford Geertz, culture is, he looks at this idea of an onion. He says it's this onion, the layers of an onion. It's like culture with the many meanings that are imbued in culture. Then he writes about cockfighting as symbolic masculinity. For him, cockfight participants play with status through the fight. So his discussion, his analysis kind of walks you through his thinking about this, and hopefully you enjoy that reading. So a little bit on Geertz, his background. He finished a PhD at Harvard University in 1956, and he worked at Princeton University. As I said in the previous slide, he worked in places like Java, Bali, Indonesia, and Morocco. And this bullet point number 2, the second part of it, is really important to me, actually, because I feel the same way. According to Geertz, field work did more to nourish his soul than the academy ever did. And if you think about, again, appropriating stuff from this course and using it in your projects, when you actually do interviews, in a way, you're kind of conducting field work. And it could be in your chair, in your room, at home, or in school, on Zoom, or it could also be just going and talking with people in person. So those activities are what we do as field workers. And so just to restate what he said, field work did more to nourish his soul than the academy ever did. Many of us in anthropology that do ethnographic work, we just love, absolutely love doing field work, talking to people, learning, putting ourselves out there in maybe uncomfortable situations just to absorb information and have conversations and make friends, no matter if it's transient, these friendships that are established. Bullet point 3, he investigated the role played by ideas in human behavior, the meaning of meaning, and the judgment of judgment. Clifford Geertz focused on the cultural creation of symbolic meaning. Okay, so Geertz, famous for this approach called interpretive anthropology. This is an approach that I use. Many people find it useful. Other people find it troubling. And hopefully at the end of this presentation, I'll have some ideas of the weaknesses of this approach. So he departed from the paradigm of anthropology as a science in search of law-like generalizations about humanity. So he wanted to distance himself from the past of what anthropologists were doing, because he didn't necessarily subscribe to the view that we were doing this in a scientific way. So from the 1970s to the present, the unbridgeable differences between interpretive versus scientific theoretical positions have crystallized into deep divisions with American anthropology. So in other words, if you look at different departments of anthropology, there's different sets of characters, and many of them have different theoretical orientations, and some of them butt heads. They clash and conflict over this approach, interpretive anthropology versus more scientific anthropology. So he promoted this notion of a document approach, which is, and you're going to hear me say this over and over, looking at culture as text that can be read. And so for him, a specific ethnographic case is analyzed such that an irreducible specificity of actual events and the elusive generality of meaningful form render one another intelligible. So for him, an acted public document, an acted public document culture is written not in conventionalized graphs of sound, but in transient examples of shaped behavior. And that's from his book called Interpretations of Culture. So in this book, Interpretations of Culture, which is one of his most significant piece of work, he, and this is another plug to think about, what definition of culture are you going to subscribe to or associate yourself with? So Clifford Geertz offers one in bullet point number 2. For him, culture derived from Max Weber's view that man is an animal suspended in webs of significance that he himself has spun. In other words, culture equals webs. And what that means is, if you ask yourself, how do you define culture? What people have done when they apply his definition, they say it's those spider webs or webs of significance that connect me to you and you to other people. And he's interested in those connections, how all of these connections that we spin ourselves, these are what make up culture. So for him, cultural analysis is not an experimental science in search of laws, but an interpretive one in search of meaning. So for him, the question is, how do people create meaning, not how meanings create people? So for Geertz and interpretive anthropology, these two things, Geertz and interpretive anthropology, are important for this reason. And this is from him in Interpretation of Culture. Quote, the object of ethnography is to understand the stratified hierarchy of meaningful structures in terms of which twitches, winks, fake winks, parodies, rehearsals of parodies are produced, perceived, and interpreted, and without which they would not, in fact, exist, no matter what anyone did or didn't do with his eyelids. So this is taken out of context. It's from one of his readings. I believe it's the one that you have. And what he does is he just talks about the significance of these gestures that we do. Like if you wink, there's, according to him, 5 or more different ways of winking. And that gesture, they have meaning to them. And so he's interested in making visible those meanings. And together, that's what makes up culture. So for him, for Clifford Geertz, our goal as anthropologists are to sort through the structures of signification that make human behaviors meaningful, to decipher those connections in an ethnographic text, and to thus enlarge the consultable record of human experience. Interpretive anthropology. So these are just a couple bullet points to give more meaning and to make sense of what the heck interpretive anthropology is. Okay, and these are all from his, there's a book that analyzed interpretive anthropology called Interpretation and Meaning, and this was all done to make more sense of Clifford Geertz's approach. So social phenomenon, like social practices, institutions, behaviors, are intrinsically meaningful in that their meanings are constructed by the meanings that social actors give them. So in other words, if you look at the University of Colorado, or if you look at our health institutions, these entities are meaningful because of the meanings that we put onto them. That's kind of like paraphrasing Clifford Geertz's approach. And then bullet point 2, social phenomenon can be understood only by unraveling the meanings that constitute them, a process that involves understanding the social phenomenon from the actor's point of view. So in other words, fieldwork is critical to try to, use participant observation, use field notes to, as close as you can, get to know people really well, and then try as best you can from their standpoint, from their point of view, to make sense of the different things that they do and say. And this bottom quote is pretty important. He believes that causal explanations, inductive generalizations, and predictions have little or no importance in the social sciences. So he's suggesting that if you look at, for example, the phrase inductive generalizations, if I'm doing work on people who use canoes and they make them by hand, they get a tree, they carve out a canoe, and then they go and do fishing and trading, by that one small act, and then me making a gigantic generalization, he's saying that's not our role in the social sciences. And then we have, when you unpack further, this theory or approach called interpretive anthropology, he looks at culture as semiotic. And according to him, man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he has spun himself. I take culture to be those webs and the analysis of it to be therefore not an experimental science in search of law, but an interpretive one in search of meaning, which I read earlier on a different slide. But the point is it's significant, especially if it's twice said in a presentation. This search involved ferreting out the singularities of other people's ways of life. And this idea for Clifford Geertz in search of local truths, theoretical formulations. So local truths for him, these are theoretical formulations that hover so low over the interpretations they govern that they don't make much sense or hold much interest apart from them. Continuing on, interpretive anthropology. So you're starting to get the point that interpretive anthropology is significant for Clifford Geertz. It's an approach of looking at culture as text that can be read to try to understand the meanings. And all these meanings that come together are significant for us to make comments and to discuss cultures. For Clifford Geertz, analysis then is sorting out the structures of signification and determining their social ground and import, and which he defines and looks at as interpretation. So for Geertz, doing ethnography is like trying to read in the sense of construct a reading of a manuscript, foreign, faded, full of ellipsis, incoherencies, suspicious emendations, and tendentious commentaries, but written not in conventional graphs of sound, but in transient examples of shaped behavior. Continuing on, culture in this acted document thus is public. So the thing to ask is what the import is, what it is, ridicule or challenge, irony or anger, snobbery or pride that in their occurrence and through their agency is getting said. Two other quotes, again, just to reinforce what interpretive anthropology is. Culture is public because culture is enacted and meaning is created, which in turn guides action. Deciphering the imaginative universe within which acts or signs have meaning is what anthropology is all about. So let me just restate that last point, the bullet point number 3. Because what he's doing is making a statement about what we do as anthropologists. He synthesizes it all in one sentence. For him, anthropology is about deciphering the imaginative universe within which acts are signs and that they have meaning. So in terms of generating theory, interpretive research does this by setting down the meaning particular social actions have for the actors whose actions they are, and stating as explicitly as we can manage what the knowledge thus attained demonstrates about the society in which it is found, and beyond that, about social life as such. Now, here's a couple considerations along methodological lines. I think I started week 1, the first day or first week of the course by mentioning that theory in anthropology, when it's discussed, you rarely separate it from methods, which are the steps that you take to collect information. So here's a couple considerations when you talk about methods of the steps that you take to do or apply interpretive anthropology. So this approach to understanding culture necessarily impacts both the process of research and the expectations of it. And here's 4 significant bullet points here. So for him, as I said earlier, ethnography is thick description. What does that mean? Why is this distinction important of just regular description versus thick description? And so, again, if you think about the projects you're going to have in your at the end of this course, if you want to apply Clifford Geertz's notion of thick description, and you're going to actually do it in the context of your interviews, it means going really deep in trying to make sense what people say and what are the meanings of what they said, as opposed to just a superficial discussion or just giving us the raw interview transcript without much discussion or interpretation. In this approach to interpretive anthropology, as I said earlier, culture is text, something that is read to understand the meanings. I'm so sorry. For him, ethnography is a fiction, and this is something that's pretty important to his approach, because for him, the aim of ethnography is capturing social discourse, as opposed to just doing like what Malinowski did, just a long laundry list of the things that people do. And so he believes ethnography is a fiction, and there's a few slides that kind of unpack this further, because it's sort of like this manufactured story of other cultures with little or no kind of reflective lens on the ethnographer, or a lack of discussion about positionality, which we'll get into next. So as Geertz came into the public mind and in anthropology gained traction with his work, what was simultaneously going on, and he's connected with this movement, is the postmodernism movement. Okay, so in anthropology, so this is pretty significant. Some people roll their eyes and kind of think it's all a bunch of BS, but other people feel it's liberating because they detach themselves from these approaches from the past that were maybe inappropriate, or they propped up Western cultures at the expense of others. And so we're going to go into now a discussion of postmodernism, because this was the landscape on which Clifford Geertz did his interpretive anthropology. So it's the rejection of promises and certainties of modernism. And to understand postmodernism, you need to understand modernism. So then the question for us is, what is modernism? So modernism is a cultural movement that is started around the 18th century to late 20th century in Europe and America. A couple bullet points here. It emerged from the Enlightenment, inspired by the Industrial Revolution. It assumed technological and economic progress. And there's this faith and power of science to yield progress by explaining the world objectively and completely. And then this idea of to intervene in the world to improve it. And there's these modern inventions such as the steam engine, electricity, telephone. These inventions inspired great faith in the potential of human knowledge. So modernism emphasized certainty that the world could be known, understood, and improved. Now, at the peak of modernity in the 1950s and 60s, Western thought assumed that all societies and would follow its example of modernization. So modernity was the standard to which other countries aspired. Developing world countries that are considered non-dominant, they needed to follow Europe's example. They needed to adopt the Western economy, the state, cultural values. And so underneath that were these ideas of universality and then, of course, ethnocentrism. So modernity believed itself universal, not a product of specifically Western history. So to sum up, at least the modernism notion is characterized by a belief in science and technology, certainty, an ethnographic understanding of the world and people's goals, and this belief in universality of modernity's aims and values. So there's this decline, or I guess you could say decentering of modernity with the introduction of postmodernity. So in the 60s and 70s, there was this beginning of questioning the authority of Euro-Americanism. There's two sub-bullet points under number one here. The European colonial power collapsed. In 1960s or the 50s, you had the beginning of decolonization around the world, and you started to see post-colonial intellectuals critical of Western tradition. So in other words, this phrase of the explosion of the third world into the first world. Also, you had civil rights and feminist movements in the West. There was attention to voices of groups that were previously ignored. And then, of course, you had the introduction and the growing momentum of the free speech movement. So the bottom sentence here in bold, modernity could no longer claim to be universal culture of human progress to which all cultures should aspire. You had newly independent countries speaking for themselves, emerging intellectual movements, and a Western tradition that had a particular history that undermined its claims to objectivity and universality. And then you start to see this approach where knowledge equaled power. So it was kind of always there, because with the colonizers, they understood, if you had the knowledge of other cultures, you can control them. But this became a major analytical term, knowledge is power, in anthropology. And there's some developments that happened. You had the attention to the role of forms of knowledge in legitimizing colonial power, concern about the role of anthropology in the Vietnam War. So I mentioned this maybe last week or the previous week. There's an anthropologist named David Price. He's gone through all like the FBI records of during this Vietnam War and other eras, other issues where the government had files on anthropologists, and also to the extent that the government used anthropology to kind of go abroad and quote unquote promote democracy, which in other words was to really advance the military industrial complex. The third bullet point here, there's a new concern for representing subordinate groups obscured by monolithic descriptions of culture. And you had Rosenberry, he was an anthropologist, he critiqued Geertz. He basically said that there's other ways of reading the cockfight, and he felt that Geertz's approach to reading the cockfight of like these important men in societies battling out their masculinity, that was one reading, but there are also other readings And that was also part of this notion of knowledge is power that was promoted around this time. So postmodernism, it's a cultural movement that critiques certain certainties of modernism, of claims of universality of Western knowledge and tradition, of scientific certainty. The hallmarks were the rejection of claims to universality and Western superiority, a deconstruction of texts. This revealed the assumptions to decenter the authority of texts. And there's also this reflexivity, which is really significant, which is a nice bridge back to some critiques about Geertz and anthropology and ethnography as fiction. There was this concern about how one's position influences one's analysis. So, for example, in your projects toward the end of the semester, you're going to be doing 2 interviews on some topic that you find interesting and stimulating and exciting. Now, your own positionality, your own position in the world, your views, that's called baggage that you carry into any kind of interview. To what extent are you going to make transparent how your standpoint and your position is going to influence your interpretation of what people say? And that's called reflexivity. And so it's significant, and it's something increasingly anthropologists are doing to be transparent and also to kind of demystify the process of creating ethnographic text. So postmodern theory, just to define it, it's any theory of society that distinguishes itself from scientific theory by a willingness to be critical and factual. Now, it led to and occurred on the same side of the coin of a crisis of representation. And so you had the recognition that knowledge equals power. And Rosaldo, that we're going to read this week, that's going to be part of video lecture number 2. So he came up with this quote: classic ethnographies left a legacy of complicity with imperialism, a commitment to objectivism, and a belief in monumentalism. So he critiques the approach that we did in the past as anthropologists and being problematic. There's also, when you talk about this crisis of representation, there's a concern for new forms of representation. In the past, there was a style of writing that served to obscure anthropology's complicity with power. And what that kind of comes to is you have many of these characters that did anthropological work. You know, they dove deep into a culture, but they didn't talk about the surrounding context of like colonialism or economic dominance by certain companies or countries. And so our lenses were so focused into the cultures that we, or anthropologists back then, neglected this larger context, which was significant because it influenced people's livelihoods. And then also this crisis of representation meant there was a retreat from grand theory. There was this idea of questioning, coming up with these large theories that can explain human behavior across cultures. And the 2 sub-bullet points are: there's an abandonment of science in favor of description and interpretation, and there is a rejection of seeking general laws of human behavior in favor of description of particular cases. So briefly, I'm going to talk about Marcus and Fisher. They had a book called Writing Culture in 1986, and they basically promoted different kinds of writing so that the writing that were descriptions of culture could be a little bit more transparent and kind of breaking with the style of writing from the past. And you could argue, or there were arguments, that some of this new kind of writing, which tended to be a little bit more along the lines of like writing literature out of ethnographic texts, for some people that was problematic because it drifted away from like the representation of culture to seeing who can write them in the most eloquent way. So there's some criticism. But the critique of Marcus and Fisher was that all knowledge is situated, but ethnographers pretend that they are objective and omniscient purveyors of truth. And so this was, again, some of the contributions of Marcus and Fisher, which was part of the postmodern movement. And this also led to an experimental moment, which broke down into, like, in terms of ethnography, a frank self-critique of the discipline's theory and methods. So there's in 86 with Marcus and Fisher's work, putting the lens on the steps that we take to collect the information and how we need to revisit those because they're problematic. Bullet point 2, how can voices other than ethnographers be included in ethnographies? Can an ethnographer give up authority? So here's a perfect place to emphasize that when you do your work in this course, if you're inspired by this stuff and you want to apply this stuff, to what extent can you involve the two interviewees in the construction and the presentation of your final project? So I know everything is a function of time and people not having enough time, but you should try to aspire, if you believe in some of this stuff, if you buy into it. So sorry. I would encourage you with the interviews that you do and the write-up, that before you present them in class, you run them by the interviewees and say, hey, Fred, I did this interview with you, and here's my synthesis of it, and here's the presentation I'm going to do, and I'd love to get your input. Because what you want to do is make sure that you're representing people's statements in a fair and accurate way, as opposed to being the one ethnographer that is standing on a box with authority, and basically creating space to give these individuals to talk back and give input. Some of them may say, thumbs up, you did a great job. But others may say, hey, I have a problem with what you did. And that kind of stuff is rich ethnographic information. So in other words, can you give up authority about your findings and your representations and your statements and open up the doors to the process of having these people you interview participate in the write-up or the construction of the presentation? So think about it. Easier said than done, but if you plan accordingly, it can be really cool, especially showing the growth and the conversation that comes out of any interaction. So you had this critique. There were critiques of classic ethnographies. Again, there's this fiction of the omniscient observer. There's this idea that people in the past, they sever the relationship between what the ethnographer knows and how she knows it. So in other words, people would put these ethnographies together, but there was a disconnect between how the people actually knew what was going on, how the ethnographer knew about these things. And you can never be objective observers of all that goes on in culture. You can only offer provisional truths. So truths are both incomplete and subjective. And so another term to borrow, again, take some notes, ongoing notes. What you're going to be presenting in the final presentation are provisional truths, things that you come up in this very short activity of doing this interview on a project that you select. Now, instead of representing and this is again the critique of classic ethnographies, instead of representing your own point of view or anthropologists from the past, their point of view, they purported to represent the native point of view. And at that time, there was rarely a discussion of how some interpretations were privileged over others. And then there's the question of whose point of view exactly, and then who are the informants or what's called study participants. And people in the past acted as though they were invisible, as though their presence did not affect natives' actions or their own interpretations. So this is just a few lines that offer critique of the ethnographies from the past. So the goal was, with postmodernism, and especially Marcus and Fisher, their book, and the work of Clifford Geertz, to decenter ethnographic authority. You want to attempt to decolonize by anthropology by decentering this authority, by recognizing historical and political circumstances that were ignored or not included in past accounts. So in other words, colonialism was neglected, as I said earlier. And you want to scrutinize the link and maybe be more transparent between the fieldwork activities and the ethnographic write-up. And then the there's an idea to view the ethnographic encounter when an anthropologist meets with his or her study participants. You view that as dialogic, which simply means it's a dialogue between a situated ethnographer and a study participant. And you want to focus less on culture and instead on the ethnographic encounter between the ethnographer's self and the native others, how they become objects of study. So again, this is anthropology going through a lot of changes to try to update itself and figure out how to be more accurate and decolonial with its comments, statements, and observations about culture. And then lastly, for Clifford, on article on ethnographic authority, it becomes necessary to conceive ethnography not as the experience and interpretation of other reality, but rather a constructive negotiation involving at least two, usually more conscious, politically significant subjects. And I'm going to end here. Thanks for your patience and sitting through this presentation. A lot of great ideas and major changes. And then ultimately we're week 6, and by the end of week 10, roughly, if I got it right, we move into more militant and activist oriented anthropology, because many anthropologists like myself look at this discipline as a platform to promote social justice and racial justice. But for now, I'll end. You should look forward to video lecture number 2. And feel free to reach out if there's any questions. I'll look forward to your papers. And again, I appreciate the work you're doing in the class. Take care.